Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. A lot has happened in and outside of South Asia in 2024. The year has witnessed significant transformations challenging the global stability and security of the world. Right from the festival of elections that were held worldwide, to army coups, impeachments, and human suffering taking place in conflicts in the Middle East, Russia and Ukraine, and Sudan, there has been a lot that has been happening this year. To deconstruct the year that has gone by, joining me today is ISAS Director, Associate Professor Dr. Iqbal Singh Sivia. Welcome, Dr. Sivia.
Hi, Devyani. Pleasure to join you today. And Happy New Year to you and to everybody who's joining us today.
Happy New Year as well. Thank you so much for joining us today for this chat. So, my first question is in 2024, the world faced conflict in the Middle East. We saw the fall of the Syrian government, war in Gaza, intensification of the Ukraine Russia war, North Korea's assistance to Russian forces, re election of Donald Trump as the US president, Iran's change of president and its tonality towards the West, impeachment of South Korea's president, and the list goes on and on. These are just a few. How do you think these challenges will affect South Asia in 2025?
Devyani, talk about starting with a big question, right? The you've listed a number of developments, crises, and political shifts that occurred in 2024. And perhaps in answering this, let me just perhaps try and summarize some of the broad strands that emerged and that will continue to impact geopolitics, geoeconomics, and domestic developments across the world. And then perhaps you can follow up with more direct questions relating to the crises that you mentioned. Now, one of the things that, and you noted this in your question itself, is that the world is definitely going through and has been going through a flux. The international order is evolving and evolving in very interesting and fast-paced ways as well. One of the key issues is the crisis of multilateralism and globalization that we saw come to the fore in 2024. When you mentioned the victory of Donald Trump in the American elections. I'm sure we'll talk much more about it in this podcast itself. But it's sort of brought these issues to the fore. But this crisis of the international order did not start with the re-election of Donald Trump. This is something that's been going on for some time. So that's one of the first things. The international order is in flux, and countries are going to have to negotiate their position, both in terms of geopolitics, but also geoeconomics. But one important dimension of this that will play out in very important, interesting, and perhaps disturbing ways in the coming year, or in this year, I should say, is the fact that we are going to witness more great power rivalry. US-China certainly is going to take up a lot of analysis and a lot of time of researchers in places like ISAS. But one dimension that we noticed emerging in 2024 is that apart from the great powers that are going to jostle it out, we've also seen and witnessed the importance of perhaps what we could describe as the middle powers. Countries like India, Turkey, Israel have played a very important and growingly significant role in 2024, and I foresee this happening more so in 2025. The other broad strand that we saw play out in 2024 is the fact that the terrains of global competition between states are not just your sort of left to what we would say, what we describe as traditional security issues. Increasingly, trade, technology, supply chains, and even infrastructure have become terrains of competition, geopolitical competition. I see this as something that states, not only in South Asia, but beyond South Asia, having to grapple in 2025 as well. And you asked about how South Asia is going to negotiate this shifting terrain that will play out in 2025. Let's be clear, right? South Asia will be impacted differently. South Asian states will respond differently, but also South Asian states will find themselves in different positions with regards to the United States, but also with China. So if we start with India, for instance, I suspect that it's quite clear that India will continue to maintain what it describes as a strategic autonomy. Um, that it will not be pushed in a situation where it has to be part of any alliance or indicate that it's willing to be part of any alliance as well. But having said that, what I do anticipate is that in the coming geopolitical and geoeconomic competition, the fact that 2024 sort of cemented a stronger India-US relation. I see that trend continuing. I don't think there's going to be fundamental change with the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House. In fact, he had a very strong relationship with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And I think there you will see some developments and building on that. So the US-India relation is likely to grow both economically and strategically. And perhaps, right, we could say that Trump has a transactional approach towards economic and politics and certainly foreign policy. Perhaps Trump's transactional approach might actually enable India to continue to play its strategic autonomy in a more conducive manner without being forced to take sides or choose. And here, you mentioned the Ukraine crisis. We've seen how India has negotiated its position with regards to Ukraine, Russia, and the US and other allies of the US as well. Coming to South Asia, one of the things I would say is that we should probably be very clear about the fact that while India will continue to be important to the US and Donald Trump, I'm not sure how important some of the other countries in the US, in South Asia would be in Donald Trump's global strategic vision. And I'm happy to discuss more of this. But on the flip side, China would certainly play a stronger and more important role in trying to gain influence and influence decisions and positions of South Asian states like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So I see that geopolitical and geoeconomic competition playing out in South Asia. And perhaps if I could just add, right, we probably need to contextualize the sort of foreign policy choices that countries in South Asia will have to make in 2025 in the context that a number of South Asian countries are going through political transitions themselves, and namely here Bangladesh and Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. I think just following up on the political shift that has taken place in the US. Now, as you said, that one of the biggest things in the upcoming year would be the intensification or the greater great power rivalry. So I will just pick your brains a little bit more on that. So, one of the most remarkable political shifts, as you mentioned, has been the comeback of Donald Trump, and who has brought with him considerable uncertainty about the future of US engagement with China and the extent of US commitment to the Indo Pacific and how it will interact with its strategic partners across South Asia. You did sort of elaborate a little bit on what the US engagement with India could possibly look like, but I would be grateful if you could elaborate a little bit more on what could be the potential outcomes of the Trump 2.0 presidency for other South Asian states such as Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. And how do you see these states responding to the evolving global dynamics under his leadership?
Sure. Devyani, a number of years ago, Donald Rumsfeld made a very interesting statement that there are some known unknowns and some unknown unknowns. I never kind of understood what he meant by that, but with the return of Donald Trump and the questions of foreign policy, that statement of known unknowns and unknown unknowns makes a lot of sense to me now. Having said that, two things that we do know looking ahead is that there is certainly going to be ramped up pressure from the US on China. And we also know for sure that Donald Trump really likes tariffs. I mean, so this is something that we can totally anticipate, and perhaps we should locate how South Asian countries are going to respond, are going to be impacted by the return of Donald Trump to power in regards to these two issues. Now, let's deal with the issue of tariffs first. Um, we can anticipate some sort of major move towards the imposition of tariffs quite soon after Donald Trump comes to power. And the question will be how extensive these tariffs will be, but also who will these tariffs be applied to? He's named a number of countries, and there's some concern that even South Asian countries like Bangladesh could be impacted by tariffs, etc. So that remains to be seen. But we do know that tariffs will be placed on China for sure. We don't know how high these tariffs will be. We also know that there will be increasing geopolitical pressure on China. Now, if we place this into context of South Asia, I've already spoken slightly about India, but perhaps I could just refer to that to sort of contrast the sort of experience that other South Asian states are going to face. One of the things about tariffs and geopolitical pressure on China would be that India could perhaps be a beneficiary of this, right? India could perhaps look to benefit from the China plus one strategy that might emerge with regards to the imposition of tariffs. We've seen also the fact that China's approach towards India seems to have changed somewhat in late 2024. There have been initiatives to lessen the border friction, etc. So this has been good for India in that sense. Of course, questions still remain about what the border agreement actually entails itself. But India is not the only player out there looking to benefit from a potential loss of manufacturing in China, or the imposition of, Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia, to name just a few, would be in that position. How India positions itself would be interesting in the coming months ahead. Now, if we turn towards the smaller states in South Asia, and I, of course, when I say smaller states in South Asia, I use the term in relative terminology, because most of the states like Bangladesh and Pakistan are by no measure small itself, but it's just comparing in terms of their size, population size relatively to India and China. Now, the smaller states would find themselves or could potentially find themselves in a position of being pressured both from the US and from China. Let's take two or three of them individually. Now, if we look at Pakistan, Pakistan has over decades maintained a very interesting relationship of balancing its relations with the US and balancing its relations with China. Looking ahead, I'm not sure how important Pakistan is to Donald Trump, but it is clear that Pakistan will have to manage this relationship with both powers. Perhaps Pakistan could also continue to expand on its transactional sort of approach towards these two great powers. It remains to be seen if developments in Afghanistan might actually lead to Donald Trump being more interested in Pakistan. But if that happens, and here I'm talking about potential terrorist attack that gets linked back to Afghanistan, or militancy that gets linked back to Afghanistan, that might lead to a sort of Donald Trump's approach towards Pakistan and Afghanistan being hyphenated. This, of course, this has happened in the past before, but this is something that could happen. But as it stands, I don't think Pakistan is high on Donald Trump's list of priorities at the moment. If we look at Bangladesh is another country has been very adept at balancing various great powers. However, we also know that when Donald Trump won the elections, the leader of the interim government in Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus, made a statement describing Donald Trump's return to power as a solar eclipse. So that will lead to that in his, and I'm paraphrasing him here, that will put Bangladesh in a very difficult situation. One is the issue of having to again balance between the US and in this case also India, and on the other hand, China. The other issue for Bangladesh would be this potential issue of tariffs coming in. Again, Bangladesh is not high on Donald Trump's priority, but if there is a blanket sort of imposition of tariffs on various countries, Bangladesh is trying to emerge from an economic crisis, but it's also poised to graduate from least developed country status in 2026. So any sort of tariffs could impact its garment industry quite badly. But more so, it's going to be the geopolitical sort of balancing that Bangladesh will need to do. Likewise, Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka has just had a recent political transition as well, both in terms of president, but also its parliament. And the new president of Sri Lanka and his government are going to have to balance again between China and India, but also China and the US. So there are a lot of moving parts in this story, and these states are going to. I'll just end by saying something very quickly that I wonder, and I don't have an answer for this, but I wonder if smaller South Asian states, and I'm referring here particularly to Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, whether they would only find themselves pressurized or would they find themselves in a situation where they perhaps have a little more agency to negotiate between these powers.
Absolutely. I think thank you so much for really analyzing that state by state and taking that thread and looking a little bit more at the domestic politics that has taken place in South Asia in the last year. We've seen that this year has been a year of elections for the world in general, but also specifically in South Asia. We saw India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. That has caused a political shift, so to speak, and the results and post-election events brought with them a greater sense of surprise and uncertainty. Actually, starting off with Bangladesh, we witnessed the re-election of Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League. However, the government was overthrown by a coup, and the path forward at the moment is unknown. This coup will have a deeper impact on Bangladesh's development story. Of course, it has also destabilized to a certain degree the political stability that Bangladesh had built over the last few years. How do you see Bangladesh faring in 2025, especially in the context of its graduation from like the LDC status?
Yeah, Divyani, 2025 will be an important year for Bangladesh in terms of how it charts its political and economic future. Um, you rightly alluded that there were important political developments in 2024 in Bangladesh with an election, but then the ouster of Sheikh Hasina and her government. Now I won't go into the story of that because that could take an entire podcast in itself. But looking ahead, what's going to happen? What I anticipate happening in Bangladesh. We know that with the ouster of Sheikh Hasina, Nobel laureate uh, Mohamed Yunus was appointed as the head of the interim government. I think something important to note about the role that the interim government is going to play is that it was very let me take one step back. Yunus stated very early upon taking over the realms of the interim government that he's not just seeing his role and the interim government's role as one of holding the fort till elections happen. Generally, that's the conception of what the interim government does in Bangladesh or used to do in Bangladesh before the whole idea of it was removed. Instead of just holding the fort till elections, till the next elections, Mohamed Yunus very strongly indicated that the interim government will lay the foundations for what he describes as a new Bangladesh. And this is important. So the indication is that in the coming year, there will be important steps taken, or at least the indication is that there is an intent to take important political steps in Bangladesh. So what has he done? He set up a number of commissions to review law and order, political development, the judicial system, and also the electoral system. But in addition to that, in addition to setting up these commissions, he's also set up a National Consensus Commission, the role of which is basically to bring together the reports of this commission, establish a sort of a consensus on what sort of political direction Bangladesh should take. Now, why am I telling you all this? It's a very long process. It will take an extremely long time to play out. So don't expect elections anytime soon in Bangladesh. That's my first thing. Maybe end of 2025, or at least late 2025, but I don't anticipate them happening any time before that. But there is the very fact that the elections are going to be delayed for that amount of time raises another question about Bangladesh's political future and an economic future. And that is the fact that while Yunus has immense amount of popular support, he has no political legitimacy. He's not won an election. And the very fact that Sheikh Hasina was ousted, one of the main issues was about the issue of political legitimacy, is something that's hanging on the neck of the interim government here. So what does Yunus and the interim government have to do? Essentially, they are going to have to sort of gain non-electoral political legitimacy. And how do they do that, right? One is to see the process of reforms through. Two, they will have to balance a number of political stakeholders in Bangladesh. And these stakeholders are a very complicated set of non-uniform actors. So one of them being the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP, which under Sheikh Hasina was the main opposition party. So far, the BNP has indicated that it supports the interim government's attempts to reform the political structure, the judicial structure, and the legal structure. But we do know that the BNP is very clear in its own reading of the political situation that if elections are delayed, it loses its ability to actually win elections in a big way, because it is the only established party that has a network on the ground at the moment. So it wants elections to be held as soon as possible, but at the same time, it can't pull the rug under Mohamed Yunus's feet, because that will reflect very badly politically with regards to those who support Yunus and strive for the ouster of Sheikh Hasina. So the BNP is balancing the situation. But the BNP also benefits from the sort of patron-client relations, the sort of political structures that the Awami League benefited from under Sheikh Hasina. So it's sort of they benefit from the same sort of political structure. So it's not very supportive of radical changes to the system. On the other hand, you have the students who were at the forefront of the protests against Sheikh Hasina. The students, it's important to note, are not a uniform group. They don't have a political organization. While they're trying to establish one, the establishment of political organizations needs financial support and needs a lot of time. But what do the students want? They do not want an election that just brings the BNP to power. They want structured, or most of them want structured and structural reforms. And one of the ideas that's been floating around is to actually get rid of the first past the post political structure and push for proportional representation political structure. Now, again, all of this is going to lead to extensive debates. So in order to sort of balance these groups, Mohamed Yunus is not going to be able to push too hard against things that the BNP are in favor of, but he's also incorporated students into the commissions that he's launched. He's brought them in as a stakeholder. But there are two other players out there. One is the military, of course. The military, led by General Waqarul Zaman, has indicated that it does not want to be involved in direct political power. Doesn't even want to be seen to be propping up a government. But we all know it's actually playing the role of the kingmaker till now. But it's also clear at the moment that as far as possible, the military would not want to get involved in the political structure. And there are multiple reasons for it. If you want to discuss that, we can discuss that. But there is, I would venture to say, there is one issue that Yunus has to be very careful about. And that is the fact that the military itself may not be too open to some of the structural changes that are being demanded. The law and order system, the military has a role in that. The military also has a sort of wing, it also plays a role in the security apparatus that have propped up the Awami League. So there is concern among the military about how far reforms could be pushed. And there are, to sum up, there are also the Islamists in Bangladesh. And here I refer particularly to the Jamaat-e Islami, which is a political party that has existed for a long time, sometimes been proscribed, sometimes been banned, sometimes been censored. But it is there in Bangladesh and it has a level of support. Having said that, in any election that it's participated in, it's not been able to gain more than 10% of popular support. So what we find is that while the Jamaat-e-Islami, and I know a number of commentators have said that the Jamaat-e-Islami is priced to win an election, etc. That's not what the political results till now have shown. But the Jamaat-e-Islami will be an influential player in the shaping and the political future of Bangladesh. Now, Muhammad Yunus has to balance all of these players. If he's not able to balance all these players, we could see the military actually playing a more politically active role. And he's got to do all this while balancing the economic structure of Bangladesh, and there are challenges there as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sivi. I think that really lays out the political landscape of Bangladesh, at the same time, kind of highlighting what the economic impediments could be. So this year seems to be quite interesting for Bangladesh. I think in general for South Asia this year, may be a year of great metamorphosis, because on one end we saw elections in Bangladesh. At the same time, in Sri Lanka, we saw the election of its president, Mr. Anura Kumara Dissanayake, who is the leader of the National People's Power. He's the ninth president, and he comes after a lot of significant political shifts as well as financial crisis in Sri Lanka. His election is also seen as a point of metamorphosis for the NPP, which was formulated only recently and ascended to power by providing leadership to the nationwide anti-establishment anger and mass protests. How do you think his government will fare, and will they be able to deliver on the promises on the basis of which they had been elected and had become such critical members of the anti-establishment protest that had been taking place in the first place? So, what do you think holds for Sri Lanka in 2025?
Well, as you rightly pointed out, the presidential elections in Sri Lanka and were led to the rise of a new political force. In fact, Aruna Dissanayake, popularly known as AKD, is a popular figure himself, but he didn't have a political party that has been long established. I mean, having said that, he has been associated with a political movement and a political party, the JVP. But the JVP has never really made political inroads as a central political party. So this was an important political shift that occurred, and it occurred due to the context in which there was widespread critique and dissatisfaction with not just I would say not just as some people have said, dissatisfaction with the Rajapaksa led political party and government, but I would say there was a widespread dissatisfaction with the established political elites in Sri Lanka. And what we found is, if you look at AKD's presidential victory, but then the NPP's victory in the parliamentary elections, you see that the party has won, or the coalition has won across Sri Lanka. So there's a sense of a need for a political shift and political transition in Sri Lanka. Now, what we found is when AKD assumed power, a sort of tapering of some of the sort of political statements and policies that had been made prior to coming to power. Now, what I'm indicating here is that AKD is associated with the left-wing party. The JVP was a sort of Marxist-inspired party. So there were some concerns about the rise of this party, etc. But even before coming to power, he had brought his statements more to the center, etc. Another concern was that he would be very pro-China, etc., and how that would play out with regards to Sri Lanka-India relations. What we find since coming to power is that he has been very clear that he's not ideologically driven to impose particular economic policies. Neither is his foreign policy going to be ideologically dominated. What he's focused on is, what at least rhetorically thus far, is on ending corruption, ending political nepotism, and reforming the economic structure of Sri Lanka. Now, how this is going to play out is an open question, because we all know Sri Lanka is emerging from an economic crisis. But it has been clear since he assumed power that he's continuing the policy with regards to Sri Lanka's loan from the IMF. What I think he's going to be very successful in is probably taking the people with him, at least in the 2025, when he sets about reforming the political structure. And there are a number of constitutional issues that he's placed as priorities to do. How that plays out is not, but I think he will have the support of people to push through some of these reforms that could lead to a greater decentralization of power in Sri Lanka. So that's one of the things that I'll be keeping an eye on. The other big issue would be, how is he going to balance the structural reforms that the IMF loan necessitates with his pro-people policies? So I'll be keeping an eye on that. Perhaps it could be a way of tinkering with the social support systems in Sri Lanka. He's not spelled out any of this clearly, but I'm very sure he and his team are trying to figure this out. He's also brought in a number of technocrats into his cabinet and government. So there are a new group of people in power who are not part of the political elites. And it's interesting to see how this will play out in the coming few months and year.
Right. Thank you. I think you very interestingly mentioned the challenge that comes ahead for the AKD's government in the future, especially when it comes to the structural balance that is required out of the IMF loan and his people-centered policy. So I think that would be interesting to watch out for in the next year. Another election, and I feel like I keep saying this again, but it really has been a year full of elections, and we've seen very different results and new challenges come across for different countries. So, another election that took place was with regard to Pakistan, where more than the result, we saw a very emboldened role of the Pakistani army and the impact it has had on the election. Pakistan has also seen a difficult and different year in the sense that their all-time all-weather friends, which they had found in China, has seen a deterioration to a certain degree in the relationship that both these countries share. There has been growing skepticism within the Chinese with regard to Pakistan, especially given the high number of attacks that they have faced within their developmental plans in Pakistan. At the same time, Trump's re-election as the US president doesn't really show to be a beacon of hope for Pakistan as well, given Trump's previous disengagement to a certain degree with Pakistan or lack of favorable treatment. So, where do you see Pakistan lie vis-a-vis its three pillars, which is one, the Pakistani army, two, its growing skeptical relationship with China, and three, the possible disengagement or aloofness from the US?
Okay, let me start with I'll start in that order. First with the domestic political scenario, the role of the military, and I'll be brief here because things are in play at the moment. Since the elections in Pakistan, there has been a continued pressure on the government and protest on the streets from the supporters of Imran Khan and his Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf Party, or the PTI. These protests have crippled some cities over the months, and there was also a very interesting development when supporters of the party in 2024 had actually attacked some military installations as well, which shows the sort of level of anger, but also the sort of, for the first time, a sort of a open sort of a movement against the military. I shouldn't say for the first time, but in some, for the past decade or so, this is the first sort of a open challenge to the military and its role in the political sphere. It's happened in the past in Pakistan, so it was interesting to see it happen again. Now, the protests are likely to continue. And what is the military doing about it? The military, I noticed you asked about the military, but you didn't ask about the Shehbaz Sharif led government. So I think that is also indicative of the direction in which politics is playing out in Pakistan. The Shehbaz Sharif government, of course, is a coalition government where he's leading a coalition which till now is sustained, but does have support from the military, right? So the military continues to be a kingmaker of sorts. Now, what we know is that the military chief, Asim Munir, again, I mentioned this about Bangladesh as well. Asif Munir is not keen to be seen as directly being involved in the political sphere. However, if we just look at recent weeks, there are certain steps that have been taken by the military leadership, which indicate a sort of clearinghouse, if I may say, and putting pressure. Now, one of these that I'm particularly interested in following is the arrest of the, if I could use the word, spy chief of Pakistan, the head of the ISI, the military intelligence unit, Faiz Hamid. Now, the arrest and detention of Faiz Hamid is portrayed by the military as one in which they're clamping down on military figures who have been involved in politics. Now, there've always been speculation about the closeness between Faiz Hamid and Imran Khan, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan. And Imran Khan, of course, had appointed Faiz Hamid to lead the intelligence unit. So this clampdown on this arrest of Faiz Hamid spells to a sort of a clampdown within the military and a signal that's being sent that to tone down the protest a little bit. Of course, there has been speculation that factions of the military have also been in support of the PTI and Imran Khan as well. So I'll be interested in seeing how this is playing out, the political dynamics playing out within the Pakistani military itself. But in short, these issues are going to continue, and let's keep an eye on how the military acts in 2025. Your second question on China and Pakistan relations, you rightly noted how there have been some tensions, and these have arisen primarily due to attacks on Chinese workers and Chinese staff in Pakistan. And there are a number of them working in Pakistan on projects that have been funded by a part of the CPEC, or the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But there's also another dimension to this, which is often overlooked. There is also some level of dissatisfaction among people in Pakistan about the how much CPEC is actually bringing to Pakistan. So that is also another dimension to this. But the third dimension to these attacks that have happened is that a number of them have happened in Balochistan, a province that there is a militant movement that is restive towards the Pakistani state. So this is playing out within that broader context. What was interesting was that the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan, Zhang Zaidong, publicly made a very strong public statement criticizing Pakistan for not being able to secure the Chinese workers in Pakistan. So that was a very public statement. But I would stick my neck out to say that I don't think we are going to see a drastic change between Pakistan and China's relations. In fact, I think we are going to see CPEC, the next phase of CPEC, be worked out in a slightly different way. But the China-Pakistan relations are not going to vanish, and they're not going to be totally destabilized by these attacks. I think there will be a way in which things will be sorted out. The longer-term relation between Pakistan and China will be sustained. And I dare say, with Trump's return to power, China would be very keen to retain relations with Pakistan looking ahead. And one thing to look at just in terms of 2025 itself is China would be funding the development of another nuclear power plant in Cheshma, Punjab. And so let's keep an eye on how that plays out. But I suspect the relationship is there to stay. Now, very quickly on the Trump, about the position of Pakistan under Trump. Again, I mentioned earlier, Pakistan is probably not high on Trump's priorities. His response to Pakistan will play out in terms of his broader sort of geopolitical and geoeconomic decisions that will be made.
Moving away from our chat about the elections in the region, there is another significant elephant in the room, which is climate change. And South Asia has emerged to be one of the most vulnerable regions to climate shocks. As per the World Bank, more than half of all South Asians are actually affected by one or more climate-related disasters, and have been and will continue to do so in the next 2 decades. This changing climate patterns has affected not only agriculture but also development patterns, and has pushed many people to poverty. Given the current domestic influx, as well as the lack of receiving of climate finance through COP negotiations, and to a certain degree failure of those negotiations, where do you think South Asia stands in its efforts towards climate change and its preparedness towards climate disasters?
Divyani, in your question itself, you noted how the COP29, which was held in Baku recently, is largely seen as a failure. And the reason it's largely seen as a failure is because of what many countries, especially developing countries and countries in what is known as what is termed the global south, see as a failure to have adequate climate financing. Just for backdrop, right? The developed countries from the developing world had pushed for something in the range of 1.3 trillion US dollars per year to finance the green transition in the developing world. What they got out of it was a commitment from developed countries for 300 billion a year. And this was something that was extensively resisted. But interestingly, the fact that Donald Trump will be coming to power push people to the negotiating table to even accept this offer, because there's a concern that Trump will pull the US out of a number of such agreements relating to the climate and of course climate financing being not even on the table in that sense. Now, this acceptance, this agreement that emerged from Baku has been critiqued, and countries in South Asia have strongly critiqued this agreement as well. India, in particular, was very vocal in its rejection of or in its critique of the agreement. India's representative to the COP actually described it, and I think I'm quoting here, paltry sum. But the other dimension that's important to note about India's critique of this agreement was that India felt that this was a rejection of a long-held sort of approach towards climate financing and the green transition, which is what's known as CBDR, or the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities, where developing states are seen to be less responsible for the problems inflicting the global environment, but also the most vulnerable at the same time, and therefore requiring greater assistance. Now, having laid that context, what we do know looking ahead and how South Asia fits into this is that with the return of Donald Trump to power, there is going to be less of a push from the US, clearly, and that's an understatement to say, to make. But the broader implication of this will be, where would the leadership vacuum be filled from? Now, this is not to imply that the US has been leading at the forefront of climate negotiations or anything of that sort. However, in international forums, who would be the power, which powers would be pushing for this? There is now a space for, where we started our discussion, that, while we are thinking in terms of global powers, let's think about the middle powers as well. There is a greater role for states like India to step up to the plate today. Now, when India hosted the G20, a number of statements were made towards pushing for greater cooperation in climate transition, green transition, climate financing programs were drawn up, etc. So perhaps we may see a role for other states here. India could work with the EU. I'm not saying it will, but I'm saying it could. There is a possibility of this. Perhaps China could also play a greater role in this, and China has indicated that it's willing to step up to the plate in these issues here. So I'll be keeping an eye on how states like India, China, not only go about their domestic green transition, but also the role they will play in the greater environment. Having said that, we also must be clear that one of the things that did come out sort of parallel to the COP29 was that a number of EU states had agreed to what is described as a no coal pledge, so that they will not develop any new coal resources, and they will not use any more new coal resources. India, and I'm just using India as an example for South Asia here, has refrained from making such a statement. In fact, India feels that it will still require the use of coal. So there is that domestic push that is necessary there as well. Apart from just individual countries in South Asia, and you've described the challenges that South Asia will face very well in your question, so I won't rephrase that. Perhaps I'll just end by saying that apart from states in South Asia having to make very difficult decisions and balancing economic needs and climate needs, South Asian states will also need to relook at regional cooperation mechanisms when it comes to these issues. And just to highlight one, hydropower sharing. If you look at Nepal, Bangladesh, and India, there's great potential. There have been steps in this direction. However, greater cooperative mechanisms need to be in place to be able to sustain this. So there's a lot of potential within South Asian states to work together. With the push towards green hydrogen, there is only greater incentive for such hydro cooperation. So let's see what happens there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sevilla, for laying out very comprehensively what the year of 2025 could hold for South Asia. We began our conversation by talking about all the events that took place last year, and we have ended on a note of looking at possible areas of cooperation for the region, which kind of brings us with a little bit of hope and aspiration for the upcoming year. Thank you so much for your time.
It'll be my pleasure, Devyani.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.